Good evening. I'm Don Gordon. I'm the Executive Director of Furman University's Riley Institute. My pleasure, of course, to welcome you, to welcome all like 498 of you. So I think we've set a record with this series. You know, we're absolutely delighted to have had a long-term 8-year collaboration with OLLI. And by the way, this is OLLI's 25th anniversary, the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute. That's great. You know, over the years, this series has looked at a number of really critical issues, not only for South Carolina, but for the country. We looked at health care, we looked at poverty, we've looked at education, we've looked at crime and punishment, we've looked at politics and the media, and now we're taking a deep dive on immigration. Each year, our goal is to share valuable, good information without political rhetoric, and do so with a wealth of facts. Tonight is the final of our 3-part series on immigration in America. The changing face of America, impact on the 2018 elections, and beyond. And we have 3 incredible people with us tonight, Peter, Whit, and Jessica. First of all, thank you guys for being with us. They were with us when the bad weather hit, and then flights were impossible to get here. And so they were nice enough to change the flights and come with us now, and we appreciate that so much. We're so glad that you're here. We're looking forward to hearing from you. Tonight we move from looking at current immigration policies and immigration's impact in America to a look at the downstream impact of immigration as we witness an increasingly diverse America. Our very own Dr. Danielle Vinson, professor of political science who specializes in media and politics, and the American presidency and American government, and by the way, whose latest book is getting huge accolades on Congress and the media. Congratulations, Danielle. Anyway, she's going to be here in just a second as soon as I get off the stage to introduce our speakers. So let's give Danielle Vinson a warm welcome.
Good evening. It's great to be with you for the 3rd session of our StraightTalk 2018. Tonight we're going to examine the country's changing demographics and what that means for our politics. We're week 1. We've learned about how immigration law is enforced in the United States and the impact that has on all of us and our communities. In week 2, we've examined the impact immigrants have on jobs and our economy. And tonight, we're taking a look into the future and thinking about how these changing demographics will affect who we vote for, what issues drive voters to the polls, and how Republican and Democratic parties talk about what matters in our country. We're joined this evening by 2 of the country's leading public opinion experts, one on the right, one on the left, who will take us into the data on the country's changing demographics and talk about how the 2 major political parties might respond to these trends. After we hear from our 2 public opinion gurus, Jessica Taylor, a Furman graduate and a political reporter for National Public Radio, will join them on stage for a discussion that will allow us to explore these issues in the context of the upcoming congressional elections. Jessica has extensive experience researching and covering congressional districts and campaigns. Some of her recent reporting has focused specifically on the impact of changing demographics on elections and congressional races. Let me introduce our speakers in reverse order. Our second speaker will be Peter Hart. Peter's one of the top analysts of public opinion in the United States. He founded Hart Research in 1971 and since 1989 has been a pollster for the NBC News and Wall Street Journal. His political clients have included leaders in the forefront of American politics over the past half-century, from Hubert Humphrey and Jay Rockefeller to Edward Kennedy and Bill Clinton. He's represented more than 55 U.S. senators and governors, including 1 governor here this evening, Governor Riley. Peter spent some time on campus talking with students in classes and over meals in the last day, and we thank him for enriching our campus discourse. Our first speaker this evening is a leading Republican political consultant, Whit Ayers. Whit has roots here in South Carolina, having taught at the University of South Carolina before founding North Star Opinion Research. Whit provides message development advice and strategic insights to high-level political clients, including U.S. Senators Marco Rubio, Lamar Alexander, Bob Corker, Lindsey Graham, and also corporate clients, including Boy Scouts of America, the Federalist Society, and Pharmaceutical Care Management Association. Whit's a frequent commentator on network and cable media outlets, including NBC's Meet the Press, Fox News, CNN, NPR, and BBC. There's literally no way for you to avoid him, regardless of what media you watch. His comments and analysis have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, USA Today, as well as numerous regional newspapers. He's also the author of the book 2016 and Beyond, which identifies the challenges facing the Republican Party and offers a pathway for the party going forward. And as of this morning, he is a proud grandfather of a new granddaughter. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Whit Ayers.
Thank you, Danielle, and thanks for the opportunity to be with you in Greenville. This is something of a coming home week for me. After I graduated from Davidson more years ago than I want to remember, I began my career in Northwood Middle School out in Taylors, teaching American history, and then I spent a year out at Travelers Rest High School. I didn't recognize either school when I went back today, nor did I recognize downtown Greenville, which has been utterly transformed from what it was when I was here. It's just an amazing transformation. If you haven't read James and Deborah Fallow's Our Towns, you ought to pick that up. They've got a wonderful chapter on the transformation of Greenville. It's a pleasure to be able to be here with the eminent Democratic pollster, Peter Hart, and with Jessica, and with Secretary Riley, whom I have admired for many years, as I served in Governor Carroll Campbell's governor's office, and I came to have a real affinity for governors. It's the best political job in all of America because you can actually get something done rather than just give speeches. So today we're going to talk a little bit about changing demographics and what they mean and what Republicans should do as a result of those changing demographics. There's some long-term demographic trends, as you well know, having been to a couple other sessions here. Back when Governor Riley was in his first term as governor, 88% of the folks who voted in presidential elections were white. And if you roll that forward from 76 to 96, it was down to 83%, a decline of only 5 percentage points. But if you roll that forward from 96 to 2016, in the second 20-year period, the decline went from 83 down to 71, or a decline of 12 percentage points. So whites are declining as a percentage of the presidential electorate at an increasing rate, and being replaced by African Americans, Hispanics, Asians, and other mixed race folks, which creates something of a challenge for a party that is overwhelmingly dependent on white voters. If you look at the children who are alive in America today, it's pretty stunning. This is a graph of the racial proportions by age, with the oldest people on the left and the youngest people on the right, and you will see that kids under 5 years old today are only 52% white, 26% Hispanic, 15% African American. In other words, and I tell this to my anti-immigrant friends in the Republican Party, you could shut the border down completely. You could cut off all legal and illegal immigration. And the only thing you would have to do to make sure this country changes is for everybody to get older. I mean, just think about the people on the left-hand side getting older with no more immigration. We need, as a Republican Party, to adapt to a different America, and regardless of what happens to immigration policy going forward. By 2020, whites will be a minority of the U.S. child population. It's not too far away, a couple of years. A minority or a majority of the U.S. child population will be some version of non-white. And then if you run that forward a number of years, you will see a very significant decline in the proportion of whites so that you get out to 2060, and whites will be down to about 43% of the U.S. population. Now, a couple of things that need to be said about this. First of all, there are those who will argue, I think with some justification, that the terms white and non-white, or white and Hispanic, will mean something very different. There's enormous intermarriage in America. And a lot of folks who might be considered Hispanic today, 10 years or 20 years from now, might be considered white. So these categories are not very clean, but the trends are very clear. And if you are in politics and your point is to win elections, you need to figure out how to adapt to this. This trend threatens some Republicans. They find it really threatening, and you see some of that threat, that fear, being exacerbated by some of the folks in politics who are using this in a demagogic way to try to get more votes. I don't find this fearful at all. I believe very much in fundamental Republican principles, in the long-time enduring human yearning for individual liberty, for the power of free markets, for the critical importance of American leadership in the world, for the critical importance of strong families as a building block of a healthy society. I don't think those principles are at all bound by ethnic limitations at all. I think they work with any ethnicity, any group. But some people are nevertheless threatened by this. Back in 2012, I visited the Republican convention down in Tampa that nominated Mitt Romney, and looked around and found a whole bunch of people who looked like me. And then I went to Charlotte to serve on a panel with Peter Hart at the Democratic convention. And my wife and I were riding the escalator up to watch the convention, and I looked out, and it looked like I was looking at the United Nations. And I looked at my wife, and she looked at me, and she said, "Whit, we Republicans are screwed." And I said, "Yeah." And she said, "You need to write a book about it." And so, with her constant encouragement and pushing, I did. That Daniela mentioned the 2016 and beyond, how Republicans can elect a president in the new America. As nearly as I can figure, Donald Trump got a hold of that book and decided to do the exact opposite on every single recommendation that I made in that book. And he won anyway. So, I still believe in the argument I made in that book, and I'll show you what a hairbreadth win it was. It's a problem because both Romney and Trump got overwhelming votes among whites, 59-39 for Romney, 57-37 for Trump. That's a landslide in political terms. But why didn't Romney win, and why was it so close with Donald Trump? In part because African Americans were 93-6 for Obama and 89-8 for Clinton. Hispanics were 71-27 for Obama and 66-28 for Clinton, and so forth on with Asians. Asians, by the way, voted a majority for Bob Dole in 1996. It's not all that long ago. One of the reasons Hillary lost, you'll see, is the lower percentages that she got than Obama among non-whites, and the turnout was lower. So that's one of the reasons she lost. But one of the reasons why Republicans have won the popular vote for president once in the last 7 elections. Now, you say it's not that important to win the popular vote if you can squeeze together a majority in the Electoral College, and that's certainly true. But I would argue that it sure does help your governing once you get elected if you can say, I have a majority of people behind me. And that was the argument in the book, in that if you wanted to get a majority of America in the 21st century, you needed to do something a little different. It's interesting, though, if you look at Trump's percentage of 46.2, that's actually closer to John McCain's percentage in 2008 of 45.7 than to Romney's percentage of 47.2. He was a full percentage point lower than Romney. So, how did he win? How did he win? Well, first of all, he won the primary because he tapped into a very angry and upset electorate. We did Marco Rubio's presidential campaign in 2016, and in September of 2015, more than a year before the election, we asked this question of national Republican voters. Which of the following comes closest to your preferred Republican nominee for president in 2016? A strong fiscal and social conservative who shares your values, a proven executive with a record of conservative results, or an outsider willing to fundamentally shake up Washington? Nationally, the proven executive leader with a record of conservative results got 18%. We knew in September of 2015 that Jeb Bush was going nowhere. $100 million or no $100 million. There simply was not a market in that year in the Republican Party for what he was selling. We thought Marco could get his reasonable share of the fiscal and social conservative, as well as being an outsider. He ran as a Tea Party guy in 2010. But when you have a pure outsider play, somebody who is running precisely to fundamentally shake up Washington, it became a rather difficult challenge. Donald Trump didn't run away with the nomination, but he certainly got a plurality of the vote in South Carolina. He got 35%, Marco got 25%, and because of winner-take-all by congressional districts, Trump got every one of the delegates to the Republican convention. Nationally, he won the general election by threading the needle in 3 overwhelmingly white Rust Belt states, and I defy you to tell me by looking at those pie charts who won those states. He won Pennsylvania by 44,000 votes, Michigan by 10,000, and Wisconsin by 22,000. That's a total of 77,744 votes nationally, about the size of any good-sized college football stadium on a Saturday afternoon across the entire country. That's 6 1,000ths of 1% of the vote. Downscale blue-collar counties swung sharply toward Trump. This is Trumbull County in northeast Ohio, manufacturing county, overwhelmingly white. Look, Obama killed Romney there by 22 points. Trump wins it by 7. It's a change of 29 points. I can go throughout those Rust Belt states and pick out county after county after county like this. But, and you haven't heard that much about the other side of it, traditionally Republican, more diverse, upscale suburban counties swung toward Clinton. I started my company in Roswell, Georgia, just north of Atlanta. We built statewide Republican victories on Cobb County and Gwinnett County, just northeast and northwest of Atlanta. Big suburban counties, rock rib Republican counties. Not exactly. Not exactly. Romney killed Obama there by 13 points. I could not believe it. The next day I woke up and Hillary Clinton had won Cobb County. So, it's not such a good idea when you're looking to the long-run success of a party to trade big, fast-growing, upscale suburban counties for smaller, slow-growing, downscale, blue-collar counties. But it worked for Trump, but it's hard to see how that would work long-term. What is the Trump effect? Well, kind of like Obama, amazingly polarizing. Amazingly polarizing. Republicans, 84% approve of the job he's doing, 7% disapprove. If you wonder why there are not more Republicans who do what my client Bob Corker did and tweet on a Saturday morning, well, the White House is obviously a daycare center and somebody missed their shift this morning. Bob's favorable rating among Republicans was cut in half in a matter of days after that tweet. I wish he'd run for re-election. He's one of the good guys in the Senate, one of the guys who make things happen. But that's what happens to you if you pick a fight with Trump. Tom Cole is one of the smartest guys on the Republican side in the House. He's from Oklahoma. And I heard him say one time, you know, Whit, in my district, Donald Trump got 69%. I got 73%. If I get in a fight with Donald Trump, I'm pretty sure that I'll keep my 4 and he'll keep his 69. That's what Republicans are looking at these days because of that number. The Democrats are almost unanimous. Democrats aren't unanimous on anything except they hate Trump. And it's almost unanimous. It's 94%. And independents split about 15 points for the disapproval, which is why Trump has never been able to get up to majority job approval in the country. He's tended to stick somewhere in the 38, 40, 42%. Along racial lines, whites, majority of whites approve. Blacks overwhelmingly disapprove, as do Hispanics, as do Asians. This is simply reinforcing the pattern that we saw a little bit earlier. Presidential job approval, one of the best predictors of midterm outcomes. This is all the presidents in midterm elections who have job approval above 50%. And you'll see at the very top, Clinton in 98 and Bush in 02 actually picked up seats in the House. The president's party almost always loses seats, but you'll see the seats loss are relatively modest, an average of 14 seats lost when the president's job approval is above 50%, 14 in the House, 3 in the Senate. But let's look on the other half here, where presidential job approval is less than 50%, and you'll start to see some rather stunning numbers. Clinton in 94, 54 seats. Obama in 2010, 63 seats. Johnson in 66, 48 seats, and so forth and so on. Trump is right about 43% today, and the averages in the Real Clear Politics average, which is right where Reagan was. That's 26-seat loss for Reagan in 82. You go, well, Obama only lost, 13 in 2014. You know why he only lost 13? Because he lost everything possible to lose in 2010. So you do that average, and the average is a 37-seat loss in the House. All the Democrats need is a 23-seat gain to take over the House, which is why you see a lot of analysts saying this is not likely to turn out real well for Republicans in the House. So a few concluding thoughts here. For Republicans to win a majority of the vote in the new America, and the new America is here, and it's going to get newer and newer in terms of racial proportions, Republicans are going to have to do better among non-white Americans. It just is a matter of math. You're not going to be able to get a majority of the vote without it. If the current voting patterns hold, we may see Republicans doing better in the overwhelmingly white states of the Rust Belt, while Democrats do better in more diverse states of the Sun Belt. So it wouldn't be surprising to see states like Georgia or Texas going much more Democratic. I don't know, they're not there yet, but they're headed that way. But while at the same time you see the Michigans and Ohios and Pennsylvanias and Wisconsins turning more Republican. House elections are more like the popular vote for president, which is why Democrats are favored to take control of the House in 2018. And every Republican candidate in 2018 will be viewed through a Donald Trump filter. That's a problem with more diverse and better educated suburban districts, which are exactly the districts that will determine control of the House. I had this driven home vividly when my friend Ed Gillespie ran for governor of Virginia in 2017. Ed won a landslide among the people who were picking the best candidate to be governor, 56 to 42%, according to exit polls, overwhelmingly. Then why did he lose? Because a third of the voters in Virginia were voting to send a message of opposition to Donald Trump. A third of them, 97% of them, voted for Ralph Northam, the Democratic candidate. Ed told me they did a poll after the election where 44% of the people who voted for Northam did not know who he was. That tells you the kind of dynamic that's going on. Now, not all states are like Virginia. Virginia's right across the river from Washington, D.C. It gets the Washington, D.C. press corps. Ed would go out and he'd have this big rally about how he's going to bring jobs to southwestern Virginia. And the first question from the press corps would be, is Donald Trump going to come do a rally for you? And it's like, I'm not talking about Donald Trump. I'm not talking about rallies. I'm talking about jobs in West Virginia. Do you want Donald Trump to come and do a rally for you? Would be the second question. I mean, he was the one who told this to me. He said, listen, every Republican candidate is going to be viewed through the Trump filter because Trump blots out the sun. He's just such an enormous presence in our politics. Senate elections are more like the Electoral College, though. So because they're more like the Electoral College, where you have smaller, more conservative states that have relatively greater influence, you're going to have, along with a more favorable map, probably the most favorable map ever for one party in a Senate election ever. The Republicans are favored to hold on to the Senate. That's not saying they will. It's going to come down to a handful of votes in a half dozen states, I think. And if anybody tells you they know who's going to control the Senate, tell them they're lying because they don't know. Okay, there's just no possible way to know. But at least as far as people who are favored go, you'd have to think that the Republicans are favored to hold on to the Senate just by virtue of the map and the fact it's more like the Electoral College. Okay, final point for you to chew on. Our political system's undergoing a stress test. Since the Civil War, we have never been this divided. We've never been this polarized. And if you don't believe that, just ask somebody about the Kavanaugh hearings on Thursday. The chances are pretty good that they reinforced whatever that person thought before they turned it on. I had a hard time watching. I watched it. It's my business. But, I mean, I kind of felt like it was a Shakespearean tragedy, you know, where everybody dies at the end, where nobody comes out looking better. It just pained me to watch both of them. It really did. And I hate a process that produced that. It's good for nobody, especially not the United States Senate. But it is what it is, and this is where we are. But I think it's safe to say that we're going to undergo a stress test, kind of like we did with the banks after the 2008 meltdown. And I suspect that our system in 2019 is going to be more stressful than in 2017 or 18. And I don't pretend to know how this is going to end, but it's pretty clear that the stress is going to be greater rather than less. So let me stop there and turn it over to the inimitable Peter Hart. Oh,
yeah. Is he great? He's a good guy. Unfortunately, he didn't leave me the clicker. No, he did. I'm darn glad to be here and grateful to be back here. Straight Talk. You got the crooked talk just first, and now you get the straight talk. That's how it works. But I'm glad to be here, and let me say that particularly honored to be back here at Furman. Governor Riley was a client that I worked for in his original election and then his re-election, and he's one of the great public servants that anybody could ever have and represents the best of South Carolina, and I'm most thankful. To wit, the new grandfather, I congratulate you, and we just can't wait for your granddaughter to become a Democrat. Yeah, you know, on the way down here, Whit looked at me and he said to me, "Yeah, Peter, I'm looking at you, and suddenly I'm saying, why aren't you a Republican? You're an old white man." Well, I'm not. I'm a Democrat. I'm going to talk a little bit about what I see in the demographics. Some of the charts are going to look the same, but my colors are prettier, I think, in any respect. So what I want to do is sort of take you through where we are and sort of the changing America through a slightly different lens. And this is a different lens. You may not recognize this person. This is me 50 years ago. And I do this to admit about changing demographics. 50 years ago, I was positive I was going to have all that dark brown hair forever. I was positive that I had a real sense of sophistication because I was smoking a pipe, didn't understand tobacco and all of that. And also, I thought the Democrats would be there forever, so I had my V sign up. So I'm going to talk about the future, but this proves the future is ever changing. And so let me make a point. We're talking about politics, but when you stop and think about life, everything is changing within our lives. And the lives that we started with, if you stop and look, essentially there is no Blockbuster anymore. Everything is quick, it's different. When I started with a cell phone, it was 8 pounds in weight. Now you stop and think about the smartphones and everything that you can do and the magic of all of that. You look and you think about Spotify, so long are the discs and everything else. All of our lives have changed, it has been transformed, and we're in a transformative era as much as anything else. Question for the group here. How many people within the last month have bought something from Amazon? Take a look around. Okay, stand up. Everybody who's bought something from Amazon, stand up. That's okay. Thank you very much. A little ripple here. Okay. Now, everybody who's bought something downtown in terms of a major purchase, raise their hand. Stand up now. Major purpose. Okay. That's how much we're going through a transformational era. It is in every element of our lives. And to look at this, this is much more important. How many people here play Fortnite? Okay. Yeah, it's only this side that plays Fortnite. For the rest of you, you're saying, what's happening in the next 2 weeks? In any respect, it is all of our entertainment. It's everything in terms of our lives. And it's happening not only in the demographics, it's happening in the psychographics, it's happening in every other way in terms of our lives. And Whit presented this and presented it really well. But yesterday is a long time ago. And you stop and look at Ronald Reagan in 1980. He won 56% of the white vote and ended up winning 489 electoral votes. In 2012, Mitt Romney won 59% of the white vote, and he won 206 electoral votes. Okay? One was a landslide, as I remember, about 40 states, if I remember correctly. The other was a wipeout, and that's the changing population in terms of America. At the heart of all of this is the issue that is very much in the center of 2018, 2020, and moving ahead, and that is immigration. It is an absolutely critical element of who we are and where we're at. And we see so much of the cleavage happening on this front. It is an issue that the Democrats and the Republicans are going to have to deal with because neither side has it right. On the left, you see Donald Trump and a little child who's been separated from their parents. And on the right, you see the wall. And essentially, what we're trying to figure out is what's the equilibrium in terms of where we're going to go. And as Whit showed you, essentially we've got now minorities in America becoming a majority in America. And it's a period of time before we get there. And if you stop and you look in terms of this, in 2016, we're going to be, the white population will represent 44% of America. The minorities will represent the other 56%. And if you look, and Whit showed you this in another way, if you look at the median year, what you have is whites represent are age 58. Latinos are 11. So stop and think about how that's going to change over time. The Latinos get older. The whites, guess what? they are going to pass. If you look at this, and the same things happened in terms of the electorate. You go back to 1976, Governor, you'll remember this. This was the Carter election, very narrow win for the Democrats. 2000, very narrow win for the Republicans through the Supreme Court, and the very narrow win by Donald Trump. And I thought Witt explained it well in terms of what happened, but it is the same story. It is the changing size of the electorate, with the minorities becoming important and young people becoming important, and the changing of age. I'm interested for the students only. How many of you grew up in a household that was Republican? Hands up. Now, stop. Keep your hands up. Now, how many of you are either an independent or a Democrat at this stage? We haven't had much change. Your parents have had a great influence on you. But in terms of changing, what we'll see is the age changes and where things move. And if you look, essentially the urbanization of America, we have moved from small towns, we've moved into the urban areas, the suburbs, the urban areas, and what you see here, the more people move into the urban areas, the more likely they are to become more democratic. And over the period of time, you can see what's happened in terms of that kind of change. Most important change of all, feminization, and where we've gone in terms of that. We've had women earn 10 million more degrees than men since 1982. And in the state of California today, Governor Jerry Brown signed a bill which said if you have a corporation, there has to be at least one woman on the board of that corporation. You can clap louder than that. But the fact that you have to pass a piece of legislation to say that, it's no longer acceptable. The change in terms of gender and everything that we've gone through. And we talk about what happened in terms of the Kavanaugh hearings last week. But it is a revolution that is happening across this country. And what we're going to see is that revolution is going to become that much more important. And the number of CEOs, the number of people who are running corporations, number of running nonprofits, running everything else is going to go through this revolution because it starts with education more than anything else. Ooh, got it. Okay. The millennials. Is that you? Do you like that bread? You don't? How many would eat that bread? Oh, look at them. Now let's try this side. How many of you would eat that bread? 4 hands go up. I knew that was the case. You know, it's always the way it is, Whit, you know. You look at this, and essentially, the millennial is the next generation. This is the change in the world. 35% of millennials are not affiliated with any religion. The change from faith to multi-faith. And you look at this, in 1975, only 5% of Americans, I'm dropping this one, 5% of Americans were cremated upon their death. It's now 46%. The change that are the basic things in our lives. 75% of millennials believe that climate change must be addressed. They are the people who recognize what is happening. The challenge facing both parties and this nation becomes so important because it is not that we're playing for this week or this year, we're playing for next century and the century beyond that, and the importance of that. And if you look, Republicans agree with that. third point. How many of you have student loans? Okay. Oh, I've got a question. How many of you think I'm going to the student section. How many of you say your life will be better than your parents' life? That's pretty good. That's a pretty good number. What we find out is that among all Americans, we believe that the next generation of Americans are going to have it less good than our generation. We've gone through 13 generations of Americans saying that things will get better. And at this stage of the game, a majority of Americans believe that the next generation is going to have it in a more difficult, tougher way to go. You look at this, the other thing is social change. And if you look, the major battle of the 1990s was over same-sex marriage. That is no longer a battle. The American public, by 62 to 38, have turned around totally from where they were in 2007. And what it tells you is the change that's going on not only demographically, but in terms of attitudes and how we approach society. It is probably the most dramatic change in social policy that I have seen in public opinion over as short a period. So you see all of these various things happening demographically, but also in terms of cultural attitudes. And then for the student section, how many are in favor of, oh, I won't ask you. No, I wouldn't. The president sitting in the front row wouldn't do it. But take a look at this. And essentially, it's socialization. The major battle was over drugs in the 80s and the 90s. We're now here nearing 2020, and essentially, marijuana is going to be legal one way or another in almost every state in America. This is exactly what the story is. And where this all comes out is in terms of what's going to happen politically and what's going to be the future. And you know, I feel so sorry for Whit. You know, Whit can talk about, oh, how don't you guys get it? Well, the answer is the poor Republicans are going to face some certain fronts. I mean, the first news is all of the changes in terms of gender, in terms of urbanization, where people are moving from and to and what is happening is a good sign, because those are the groups that the Democrats are strongest with. Secondly, immigration remains a hot button. It is going to be a hot button. It is something that Donald Trump talks about at all time. But if you go back and you go back to the South in the 50s, or you go across this country, when we talked about help me out, segregation, we've moved out of that in terms of where we are, in terms of our laws, in terms of attitudes, etc. This is the same thing. There will be an assimilation. It will come over generations, from one generation to the next, and all of this, again, a change. And the Republican Party, as Whit suggested, cannot continue to be all white. It has to be able to figure out how do they get beyond that, how do they attract women and minorities, and at the central part of this, they're going to have to deal with the issue of immigration. If they don't deal with the issue of immigration, essentially talking to Hispanics, to Asians, to African Americans, I think is exceptionally different. And finally, in terms of the change on social attitudes, those are changing, and all of this is where America is headed. And I don't want to leave this as just a democratic idea. I want to admit Democrats have to understand. For the Republicans, I think the challenge is they have to be able to get past where they're at. And past is on all the central issues as it relates to immigration or social policy, et cetera. And for the Democrats, is my point. Wait, there's still hope for the Republicans, okay? See, I always do something good for the Republicans. And for the Democrats, we have the ability to grab defeat from the jaws of victory. And the way in which we do it is we tend to try and go too far and too fast and not understand where the middle of America is going. And I think 2016, when Donald Trump was saying it's about make America great again, it really turned out in a different way. It wasn't about make America great again. It was go back and save America as we remember it. And what voters are going to do is they're going to move forward. But for the Democrats, I think the challenge is to go with the flow, not necessarily jump ahead of the flow, and that's the challenge they face. So as I look at it, what I would tell you is both Whit and I see a new America, and the new America that we see is a challenge to both parties. Thank you very much.
We'll invite Whit and Jessica to join us on stage as soon as we get the furniture arranged. This is also a good moment for me to tell you, we're going to try to leave about 5 or 10 minutes toward the end for questions from the audience, so be thinking.
I have a question. Do I get a rebuttal?
Seems only fair.
I will give you that moment in just a second, but I want to give the first question to Jessica, and then you can jump right in and butt to your heart's content. I told them they were allowed to talk to each other and not just through me. It's more fun that way. All right. Jessica, I want to start with you. I'll let you finish your water first. You've covered elections for about 10 years now, at least. You've covered some campaigns already for the 2018 elections. Given what these two gentlemen have said, how do you see these new trends playing into this year's congressional districts, the makeup of those districts, and the kinds of campaigns that are being run in those districts?
As Whit pointed out in his presentation really well, I thought, you really have the battle for the House and the battle for the Senate are really two fundamentally different battlegrounds. That the challenges that he talked about with the Republican Party are really manifested in so many of the districts that are going to determine the fate of the House. These suburban swing districts, he mentioned Cobb County, think about suburban Houston, suburban Dallas, Kansas, Topeka, Orange County, California, that used to sort of be the bastion of conservatism, has dramatically changed in the 2016 election, flipping from having voted for Romney to voting for Clinton. And districts are just, you know, suburban Richmond even could flip. These are vastly changing areas, and it's being driven a lot by college-educated white women that really see this as their chance to voice a dissatisfaction with President Trump. I think that immigration is a motivating issue. I think there are a lot of motivating issues, but I think that's where we can really see the most change. And I would say at this point, Democrats need 23 seats. I think they're on upwards to pick up at least 30 plus at this point. I would say it's more likely than not that the House will flip. But then you look at the Senate battlegrounds, and the voters that President Trump appealed to, those are the states where he has to do well. I think that's why you see him going to these Senate battlegrounds. He's not a help in House districts. House candidates in a lot of these places, they don't want him anywhere near there. But if you're in North Dakota, if you're in West Virginia, that he won by 20 plus points, you want him to come there. You want him to energize the base, and he still has the ability to do that. So, you know, John Edwards talked about two Americas. I think we're talking of, it's two very different types of Americas that we're talking about. A more diverse America, which is where we will see more of the country going, but in these states that are still overwhelmingly white, I think that's why you see that the Senate is much, much harder, even though Democrats only need to pick up 2 seats. Getting to those 2 seats holding on to their incumbents. They have a chance in some of the more diversifying places if they pick up Nevada and Arizona that have a growing Hispanic population, but they have to hold on to all of their incumbents as well, which is a very difficult task.
All right, what did you want to say?
I think it's a mistake to underestimate the capacity of human organizations to adapt to change. If Donald Trump had lost running on an appeal to whites, I think you would have had a lot more people in the Republican Party looking at the rally that we had in Charleston with the Rubio campaign, where we had on a stage Marco Rubio, Hispanic American conservative, Tim Scott, African American conservative, Nikki Haley, Asian American conservative, and Trey Gowdy, traditional white guy conservative. And I took a picture of that and I said, that is the Republican Party of the 21st century. It's out there and it can come to the fore, but it's not going to come to the fore in the current climate. The other point I'd like to make is that Democrats have as many problems as Republicans, believe it or not. There are really two parties. The energy is on the far left, but there's still the sort of Clinton, Peter Hart part of the party as well.
Oh, sure. Get me right in there with the Clintons.
But I mean, just imagine, what if it had been a Bernie Sanders versus Donald Trump election? Would we really have just had two candidates, or would a Michael Bloomberg or somebody like that have jumped in? I've preached my entire career in political science saying our institutions are so structured for only two parties, but I'm beginning to wonder if that's still the case anymore with the divisions in both of the major parties.
And I think, and if I can jump in too, I think an important point to make is when you talk about, a growing number of Latinos and blacks and multiracial people, as you saw, they didn't come out for Clinton, and there is a real chance that you have to energize those voters, and Hispanic voters especially are very hard to energize, either access to voting. Some people are working multiple jobs, just making time to vote, understanding how they can vote and things too. You're seeing a lot of voter mobilization efforts, but two of the most Hispanic congressional district that is up this cycle that in the competitive universe is California's 21st district, David Valdeo, and he is heavily favored to still win, even being a Republican. The next one is in Texas. Texas's 23rd district, which runs along the Mexican border there, sort of ground zero for this immigration debate. And Will Hurd is one of the few African-American Republicans running against Gina Ortiz-Jones. They're a Latina candidate, but he actually still is a slight favorite to win. So, I mean, this is not just because you even have a Hispanic candidate running or that you were running in a very Hispanic district. It's not a silver bullet by any means in getting those voters motivated. New Mexico's 2nd district is another one that is a majority Hispanic, that is a toss-up district that I would look at too as sort of a good test case for that too, because in fact the DCCC, the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, started running specific voter mobilization ads there, which was really an unprecedented step of encouraging people, Latinos specifically, to register to vote. But that is a population that Democrats have a hard time energizing to go to the polls.
That raises an interesting question, particularly Peter and Whit. How should political candidates be talking about immigration on both the right and the left to address all the issues that have been raised thus far?
For Republicans, look at the way Marco Rubio talks about immigration. He consistently gets a majority of the Hispanic vote in Florida, but it doesn't take a Hispanic candidate to do it. George W. Bush got a majority of the Hispanic vote in the Sun Belt in 2004, 44% nationally. But you got to try, But if you listen to the way Marco Rubio talks about it, he talks about it very much in terms of traditional Republican aspirations for a better life for our kids than we've had. He taps into that long-standing American value of renewal and opportunity for all. There's nobody better in our party on that subject, or I think most any other one, in terms of how you articulate it, how you talk about it, than Marco Rubio.
And let me pick up on where Whit is, because I think one of the great mistakes is to think that because a group votes a certain way, women's are overwhelmingly Democratic, men happen to be overwhelmingly Republican, that somehow that means for the next generation or more, that group will stay in the same lines. And what I think the Democrats have recognized is, for example, they've lost the blue-collar white vote, even though they've supported many of the tax programs and many of the programs that that group of people would support. And what Witt is talking about is important for the Republicans. I think the Republicans, as long as immigration is structured the way that they have structured it as a party, not necessarily an individual, I think they have a challenge. But once they get beyond immigration, then I think there are a series of issues that relate to faith, that relate to law and order, or to values and societies, that I think the Republicans can talk to the Latino and Hispanic vote, and I think it becomes very important for them. And so for Democrats, I think there's always a sense that because we've won a group on a series of issues, that they remain in our wheelhouse for a long time. I think the Hispanic vote within this period that we're looking ahead will become much more competitive, and I think it's much more open. And I think the challenge is for the Democrats to talk about future aspirations, not just about immigration or past policies.
The faith community is something I think that is interesting to look at when it comes to immigration too. So we did a poll with Marist in July where we asked about immigration, and nearly half of registered voters said that Trump is changing immigration policy for the worse. 40% said he is improving it for the better. But the highest number, when we factored out Trump supporters, that was the highest one that supported Trump's immigration plan. The next highest were white evangelical voters. 67% approved, only 27% disapproved. And I think that's why when you look at the evangelical community, there's similar concerns that Republicans have, that they are losing younger voters, or not younger voters, younger people of faith. And you mentioned the increasing number of millennials that identify with no faith, where they are losing that with a diversifying population. But I think that Trump appeals to sort of that old world sort of sentimentality, sort of for the good old days. And I think you can see that really alive sort of in American evangelicism too.
I want to push a little bit further into this idea. We often think about the Hispanic vote, but it seems quite obvious that there are divisions among the Hispanic voters in the United States. You have the divisions along different faiths. You have young, old, gay, straight. You've got Cuban American. You've got Puerto Rican American. You've got folks from other parts of Latin America. And so one of the interesting questions I want to ask is the immigration debate right now affecting all of them the same way? How will it affect them long term? At what point do we start seeing those other issues, those other divisions among Hispanics becoming more important than the immigration issue itself? Or are we already at that point?
We do a lot of work in Florida, and Florida is a microcosm of exactly what you're talking about. You've got the Cubans who are rock rib Republican, particularly the older Cubans. You've got the Puerto Ricans. About 1 million Puerto Ricans have moved to Florida since the hurricane. But they're American citizens. They don't care that much about immigration. You know, I mean, they're already Americans. And then you have a lot of folks from Latin America and Central America in Florida. And so you have these cross-cutting motivations with very, very different interests. And a lot of Hispanics are particularly interested in health care, because so many Hispanics do not have health care. So there are a lot of different ways to appeal to different portions of it. Ed Gillespie, when he ran for governor, had his campaign literature translated into 14 different languages for Northern Virginia. And that shows you what it's like running in a diverse state or a diverse area like Northern Virginia. It's something of a challenge for those of us who speak only English.
I'd simply add to all of this, I think the gateway issue, as much as anything, comes back to immigration, because I think in many respects, whether you're of one group, whether it be Puerto Rican or Mexican or Central America or Latin America, I think that essentially it is sending a message And I think the message that the Republicans send on immigration ends up with, you're not as welcome as others are. And I think that's a challenge for the Republicans.
I had a Republican strategist tell me before I think it was in 2012, say just that this was sort of a gate issue, you know, a sort of an issue that if you were talking with Latinos about immigration, that he said, and it's always stuck with me, if you want to deport grandma, you're not going to be able to reach these people. That, you know, this could be a make or break issue if you are not reaching this community, if they leave with the feeling that you don't want them there, or their family would somehow be unwelcome in the United States. But we have seen increasingly, and I've watched many, many Trump rallies for my job, and I've been to several, and in fact, he's speaking tonight actually in my hometown, and we see Trump, as the midterms, to gin up his base. He's using that fear of immigration. He talks a lot about MS-13 and gangs and sort of this fear that, talking about that, sort of riling up his base, that this person could be killed. You know, they was talking the horrible murder in Iowa, which even the college student's family said they didn't want it used as a political pawn. You saw a lot of Republicans saying, we really need to, our Trump supporters saying, really need to talk about this. It really made its way over social media and things too. And we have seen it. Republicans did use it some in the Virginia governor's race, the idea of MS-13. We saw it in another swing district, Pennsylvania's 18th district, which was the one special election that did flip toward Democrats. It has not been as motivating of a factor. I think it could have an effect, again, in some of these Senate races when you're trying to gin up the base and get them out to the polls. But in swing districts and in swing states, it is not proven as effective a message.
Yeah, it is inclusion versus exclusion. And if you are Hispanic, I think you get the message.
To get something done in the Washington of today, you're going to have presidential leadership. And it's going to be out front and aggressive presidential leadership. Trump has an opportunity to do a Nixon goes to China thing on immigration. He's given no indication that he will. But, I mean, he's got that opportunity. But I'm stunned at the utter inability to address even the easy parts of immigration reform. 80% of Americans think we should have a secure border. 80% of America thinks the DACA kids ought to be allowed to stay. How complicated would it be to put together a compromise with just those two pieces on this little narrow slice of the issue and get an 80% vote on it? They can't even seem to get that done, which is just really frustrating for some of us who think immigration reform is a critical part of our future.
But as we get more, and if a lot of the Republicans that could lose this year, we were talking about this in the car, are sort of those more moderate Republicans that could be open to immigration reform, they're likely the ones that are going to lose. People in safe Republican seats, they're more worried about a primary challenge and how they may support this. So ultimately, even if Democrats take over the House, you end up, I think, with a more polarized Congress. We saw this certainly after 2010 because most of the Democrats that lost were these blue dog Democrats that were open to compromise. So you're losing that center as we go forward, and I think that's why we're headed toward an even more polarized Congress.
I think that's such an important point that Jessica just made. It is just so central, and what is happening in this country is that we're ending up with blue and red, with no sense that those people in the Congress have to worry about the general election. All they have to worry about is, if you're a Democrat, will you be challenged on the left? If you're a Republican, will you be challenged on the right? And until we find a way in which we can make districts fairer or more competitive, essentially we're defeating the essence of democracy, which is compromise, and what we have to do. And Whit and myself are on opposite parties, but we work on a lot of issues together because essentially there are compromise places that the two parties can get to, and we need to get there.
Why doesn't the primary electorate seem to share that view compared to the general election electorate? Because what I'm hearing from you guys up here is vast majority of the country wants certain things in common on immigration, border security, a pathway for legality for the DACA kids. what is it going on in that primary electorate that seems to make that so difficult? Because these candidates seem to be, the elected officials seem to be worried about losing in a primary, not so much their safely drawn general election seat.
The first understanding of that is to realize that primary electorates are a small fraction of general election electorates. You could have like 10 or 20% of the people in the country vote in a primary compared to a presidential election. So what that means is that you're appealing to a very narrow slice of people. And then the second part of wisdom in this is that the activists, the energized people, are those who tend to be on the far right in the Republican Party, the far left in the Democratic Party. And so you end up with candidates who are being pulled farther and farther apart, and they're running farther and farther to the left and right. And I think Jessica's exactly right. We're likely to end up with a more polarized Congress, which is one of the reasons why I said I think the stress on our system is going to get worse before it gets better, because it's hard to see how 2019 is going to be any better, particularly if the Democrats take over the House and impeach Trump, which I think is a likely outcome.
There are some states that have tried different methods, and we'll see whether this ends up with less polarization or less polarizing candidates. I think to an extent it could and has in some instances. California now has a jungle primary system, as does Washington, where the top two candidates advance to the general election regardless of party. Maine is trying ranked voting this year for the first time. So those are two ways that you're not pulled as far to the extremes of each party.
Looking at my watch, Jackie's holding up signs, and I'm trying to remember which number they mean.
He held up 10, and I'm sure
and I'm
she's
trying to
talking
remember whether
about
it's that
Danielle.
10 minutes before I'm supposed to stop asking questions or 10 minutes before y'all are supposed to stop asking questions. I think I figured it out now. All right, I'm going to ask at least one more question. There is a group that we haven't really talked much about, and that is the Muslim community. They're a small part of our electorate, and we have certainly seen some immigration policies in the last year and a half that are important to that community. What do we know about the political leanings or voting tendencies of Muslim Americans?
I'd answer, but I don't know.
So if you listen to some people in my party, they're about ready to impose Sharia law in the United States. So, we don't really know. They're such a small proportion of the community. I mean, it's hard enough to get a slice of, say, the Jewish community in any kind of national survey, and Muslims are a lot smaller than that. So I'm like Peter. I honestly don't know.
You know, I think that I have a friend who is Muslim, so I've talked with her about some of these things, and I was struck sort of, you know, I grew up in a very conservative evangelical background and just struck with the sort of commonalities and some of the values we were raised with. And I think that there is some cultural conservatism there that Republicans very much could tap into, but it's sort of what we're talking about with Latinos too, when there is sort of this uprising sort of against them, which I will say George W. Bush in the wake of 9/11 was very cognizant to tamp down on. And I think that
Responsible.
yes, and we have not seen that going forward, where there is this sort of fear being stoked, and the same way that I think that could make them hesitant to vote Republican if they're sort of all lumped together as some sort of terrorist cell or wanting to impose Sharia law and just these broad, gross stereotypes in a way.
Talk to us a little bit more about how these changing demographic trends are affecting white voters. How are they responding to this? Is it uniform, or is there diversity among white voters in their reactions?
Well, I mean, I think there's tremendous diversity it's those that are pushing for change and those that are pushing for the status quo. If you're a woman, the answer is you're pushing for change in terms of society, particularly younger women, and they look and they wonder why they're not the heads of corporations and all of the opportunities being open to them. There's another element of it, and that is how they're treated both in the office and in society. I think it's terribly important. I think you have difference between parents and children, different set of values. That always happens in every generation. And I think there's another whole thing in terms of economics. So on all of these various cuts, we can talk about whites and we can talk about minorities, but in the end, a lot has to do with generational change. And generational change, the people who are seniors in the audience, we're all part of the generational change in terms of integration. We're part of the change in terms of the women's movement at the beginning. That's what happens. So we always move forward and we find a new equilibrium. Each step is a hard step to take, but when we've taken it, we probably end up as a whole as a better society.
The critical variable for me in answering that question is education and class. The folks who are doing well in the global environment, the global economy, the people who are well educated, who have the skills that are necessary for the 21st century, are not that threatened. It's the folks who don't have those skills, who are struggling economically, who are most threatened by immigration. I've done a number of focus groups with Trump voters, particularly blue-collar Trump voters in the Rust Belt. And I was struck. I was, kind of prepared to go in there, with, flag waving and we love Trump and he hung the moon. And it wasn't like that at all. It was, they were much more reasonable about it. They were like, listen, we get the joke about Donald Trump. I wouldn't want to work for him either. We realize he's not a particularly nice person, but face it, our whole community around here is ravaged with opioids. Most of the manufacturing jobs have left and gone to Mexico. Our families are falling apart and disintegrating, and we had a choice between a guy who said he'd help us and a woman who called us deplorable. What the hell did you expect us to do? And you put it like that, and it sort of makes a lot more sense than it does just sitting inside my Washington Beltway community.
The one thing I have heard from voters as I've traveled about Trump, even if they've voted for him, is I wish he would stop tweeting. I hear that from almost everyone.
Good luck
I think
with
a lot
that.
of Republicans feel that same way too, yes.
And so important because what they're saying is what we're looking for is a sense of public dialogue rather than necessarily dividing us. What is it that unites us? And they don't get it enough. They don't hear it enough. And just to let you all know, Whit and I are going tomorrow morning to Tommy's Ham House in order to learn what real people think.
I'm going to ask one more question, and then we're going to get questions from our audience. Since everything in American politics now comes back to Trump, I'm going to come back to Trump. Immigration's been one of his issues from day one, immigration, border security. How is that going to play in the midterms? I mean, his specific policies. Is this going to energize Republican base? Is this going to energize the Democrats? Who gets energized about this issue, or is it just sort of a wash between the two?
It's hard to imagine the Democratic base being any more energized than it is. They're just like, can we go vote tomorrow? We gotta vote tomorrow. But according to at least our data, the Republicans are pretty darn fired up too. I mean, they feel like control of the government's at stake because it is. You really have to pinpoint the critical districts and states that will determine control of the House. And at least in the House, control of the House and the Senate for the states. Control of the House is going to be driven in large part by well-educated suburban districts where college-educated women are a critical part of the mix. That is one of the weaker areas for Donald Trump, and one of the areas where that immigration, particularly the restrictive immigration message, plays least well. It'll play fine in hardcore Republican districts, but nobody's going to beat a hardcore Republican in those districts anyway. But in the districts that will determine the control of the House, immigration does not work particularly well for Republicans.
Let me take this on just slightly differently, and that is what you have to recognize is elections are about the voters. They're not about the people in Washington. They're not about everything that the media may say that they're about. They're about the things that people have to deal with day in and day out. And I don't want to say that the Kavanaugh hearings have no importance, because they do, and they are important. But what counts to the voters is, number one, health care. That's what they're dealing with. That's what they care about. That's what they're worried about. Number two, the economy, which they are satisfied with and happy with, and the president gets credit for it. He spends too much time talking about other things rather than the economy that would help him. Number three, they care about immigration, and that's important. And then they care about other things, such as the issue of guns in our society and violence. They care very much about the environment and what we're doing to the environment. There are a series of things, but in the end, as any good politician will tell you, it's about voters and it's not about Washington. And the thing that I have not mentioned, or any of us on the panel have mentioned, is the Mueller hearing and the investigation. To be perfectly honest, the voters are not into that. That is not what they're thinking about. That will come in to play, I'm sure, next year or later. The voters are the ones who decide the agenda, and in the end of the day, what we learn is when people are unhappy and disappointed in areas, that's what they look to change. And this is a period where, while voters are happy about the economy, the president has spent precious little time talking about the good things that are happening, and a tremendous amount of time about the bad things that he doesn't like. And I would conclude by saying, on the trade issue, it should be a, quote, macro issue. It's going to be a micro issue, and it's going to be important in the communities that have been hurt on the areas of trade, rather than a macro issue where people are talking about the bigger issue there.
All right. Do we have questions from the audience? And we have students with microphones, so wait till they get there. I'm going to move to the podium where I can actually see you. Who has questions? The gentleman back here. Down that aisle. Hold your hand up so she can find you. And I need to take the rest of my microphone with me.
Hi, thank you. You've mentioned that you think things are going to get worse. How long is it going to take? All these things run in cycles. How long is it going to take, and how is it going to happen that things get better and people start working across the aisle and doing some compromising?
Peter, I'll let you take that one.
So I said to Noah, build the ark. It's going to take one of two things to make this happen. First is, we're going to either have to deal with the issue of money in politics, which is the worst thing that has happened. And what it is it's no longer your election. It is the election of the special interests. And the amount of money that is being poured in from the left and the right, from the business community, from the labor community, all of those things has taken the election away from you. Because at this stage of the game, they need your vote. They don't need the things that essentially is the dialogue and everything else that goes on. So one way or another, we're going to have to be able to deal with money. The second thing we're going to have to deal with is, how do you get the districts to be apportioned on the basis of population rather than on the basis of just partisan drawing of slivers and lines, et cetera? Because when Dick Riley was governor, probably about 250 of the 435 districts were competitive districts. That is, could be switched from Democrats to Republicans in any given election. At this stage of the game, Jessica, you help me out, I would say we're under 100.
It's about at 100 to 10.
And you look at this, and as long as we end up with only 110 districts that are essentially in play, you're always going to have elected representatives caring about their base and not caring about how do you come across the aisle and get a coalition.
I will add a third thing in there that I think that is sort of a Pandora's box that has been opened that I'm not sure how we put back in there, and that's the rise of social media. I think that it can be a good thing, that it's a tool that I use that's important in my reporting, but it's also just such a furnace of hostility and negativity that people can get on there, share just horrible things, or just only find the news that they like and go toward that you can turn on just Fox News or on CNN. It is so, you can just find your bubble, and that's on both the left and the right, and get in that you don't even hear what the other side thinks or things like that too. And I think that social media has certainly perpetuated that. There's actually a very good article in The Atlantic this month that sort of talks about that and sort of the rise of factions that is spurred from social media that sort of Madison warned about in Federalist 10.
I'll add one more to that, and that is the critical importance of leadership. I'm continually stunned at how much difference the leader of any organization makes, whether it's a college or a middle school or a corporation or a state. One of our clients is Bill Haslam in Tennessee. He, after 8 years, has a 72% job approval rating with majority job approval among Democrats, Republicans, and independents. How can that happen in this day and age? It can happen because that's the way he's governed. He's governed in a way to try to bring people together. And every time I get really discouraged about any institution, I remind myself what a major difference the leader of that institution can make. And so let's not underestimate how critically important that is for the functioning, the effective functioning of any institution in our society.
Nicely stated.
Okay. Other questions? Do we have any student questions? I'm looking at students to sort of, they need encouragement sometimes with this. Okay.
They're so
All right.
shy.
Then I'm going to come back over this gentleman.
Sally, ask a question.
I have another easy question, and that is, if we all talk about how important the voters are, and it's our election, et cetera, when are we going to get rid of the Electoral College so that the popular vote really counts?
I will let you go to North Dakota, South Dakota, Utah, Iowa, Rhode Island. Sorry. There are too many people who live in too many states that benefit from the Electoral College. That's not going anywhere.
Got a question over here. Somewhere we have a microphone. There we go. She's coming. Up this aisle and right over here. This direction. Yeah. There we go.
Hey, thank you for joining us today. I was just going to ask, listening to both of you sort of speak, I can't help but wonder, so our generation has, I think, become less polarized in terms of party affiliation. A lot of people don't associate themselves with either one of the parties. So just the nature of this conversation, I think, is kind of interesting. Have either one of you really felt, I guess, threatened, or do you see anything happening with the fundamental nature of the political parties changing, i.e. What's happening in New York with Miss Cortez, or any other sort of fringe movement right now in American politics that really may not be one in 5-10 years from now?
The point you're making is why I raised the possibility of a third party or a multi-party system of some sort. Don't underestimate the enormous import and impact of our fundamental structure. I mean, you get elected as a libertarian or an independent, the first thing you got to do when you go to Congress is to pick a party, otherwise you're not going to get a committee assignment.
Yeah.
So there are these enormous institutional structures. In the American political system, we force coalitions before the election. In the parliamentary system, everybody can run on these multi-parties, and then they got to have a coalition to reach a majority after the election. So it's a fundamentally different dynamic, but I'm just wondering if it looks like the two-party system is so unresponsive, particularly to your generation, if that might not lead to some other movement, or at least some evolution of one of the two parties, or maybe both of them, into a different beast than we simply don't recognize today.
Other questions? I'm going to go with Mr. Saul right here.
Thank you. Thank you for coming. A question, why do so many people hate Trump or dislike him when he has reduced taxes, reduced government regulation, got us out of the Paris Accord, and has now completed trade deals with Canada and Mexico?
I get asked that question all the time. And they throw in things like the Keystone Pipeline, like the massive deregulation, like the stock market booming, like unemployment at record lows. I mean, and ISIS is defeated. I mean, they tick off all these things, and they go, why isn't his job approval 60%? And the answer is very simple. People are not evaluating Donald Trump based on the accomplishments under his leadership. They are evaluating Donald Trump based on his conduct and behavior in office. It's no more simple than that.
Exactly.
I mean, he is a non-traditional president, and he has severed the traditional link between economic well-being and presidential job approval, based on the state of the economy and the fact that there are no major wars facing us today. He should be at 65% job approval. And the fact that he's not is because exactly of what I just said. People are not evaluating him on that dimension. They're evaluating him on a completely different dimension.
It's good to get a debate going across this side.
And just as we're getting a debate going, I have been given the signal that it is time for me to put an end to questions and invite Secretary Riley to come give some closing comments on our Straight Talk series.
Well, boy, that was good, wasn't it? I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I know all of you all did also. I want to thank Peter and Whit, people that I have great respect for, both of them. Peter, I'm a little closer to, as he pointed out. He handled my campaign for governor when I was running at a very low 4% and won. But he came in Columbia, and we were meeting. I scraped up enough money to get this great pollster to give me a complete poll in South Carolina. And we were all excited in Columbia. It was December, cold, rainy. And Peter came in and he said, well, I've got to tell you, you're at 4%. And I said, boy, we paid a lot of money for that, I'll tell you. Anyhow, he gave me some great advice, and I did what he said, and it turned out I started doing better and better. And so I thank you, Peter, for that. And I have great respect for Whit, and a lot of his clients are great friends of mine, like Lamar Alexander. But overall, thank you, Danielle, and thank you, Jennifer. It was really good, Jessica, for all of you all. Now, this evening's program really was the last in this series that we have every year, the Riley Institute and OLLI. It's a three-part series, and a lot of you are here for all three parts. Our goal has been to broaden and deepen people's understanding around the issue of immigration in America, as we know very well. And we sought to build a common understanding of the facts about America's current immigration policy, the enforcement of it, the impact of it, what the research shows about the impact of immigrants on our economy, what polling indicates about the political impact of the changing demographics in America, which has been very clear tonight. Some of you may be wondering now, what happens after we've gone through all of this? It's a very confusing issue. What can we do, we citizens of this great country, if we really want to respond in some way with information that we've received and what we've learned, what should we do? And let me offer two suggestions. They'll be rather broad because it is awfully difficult to get specific about it. First, I would say we absolutely need to continue to educate ourselves. Pay attention not only to the headlines, but the deeper story underneath the headlines, and get your news from a variety of different media outlets. Listen to the other views. I think that's extremely important. I think that has come through in this discussion tonight. Listen to others' views with the idea of seeking an understanding between you. An educated citizenry, though, is absolutely key to our democracy. So I think that's first. Second, I think it's up to us to remind our leaders that they must work together, regardless of their political affiliation, and that we have elected them to serve the public good. And please remember that term, the public good. From my perspective, a good public servant is positive and also respectful. He or she must be willing to listen to both sides. Every issue has sides to it, but collaboration is a key word in my judgment. Anything to work, you have to have good collaboration, make fair and principled decisions. A good public servant should have high integrity, obviously, and have a strong work ethic and care deeply about all of the people. It is a democracy for all of the people, even those who might be different and with whom we might disagree. So let's elect leaders who promise to be good public servants and then hold our elected officials to be accountable. That is the two very broad suggestions I would have, and I hope that is of some value to you. I thank you all for being here. I thank you for your great interest in a very important subject. I'm curious to see what our issues are going to be next year. I was thinking of 2 or 3 as they were talking here today, but last year, of course, was about social media and turning facts into fiction. And this year has been a very appropriate subject for all of us. Next year, any of you have any suggestions, please share them with us. But I thank you all for being here, for taking the time to learn more about the very important topic. I thank you again to our speakers. Both of you all, Peter and Whit, were excellent. Thank you all from OLLI at Furman who are here, and what great supportive group, and the staff of the Riley Institute. Thank you all always. We look forward to seeing all of you again next year, and we'll hopefully have a subject you're interested in. Thank you all for being here.